Let's move on to the core business of this evening, which is to hear Anitra Nelson. And Anitra's talk, I think, will follow very well from last month's talk, which was with Mike Salvaris, as you may remember. His talk on that occasion was that well-being should be the core goal of government, not economic growth. So we're very privileged to have Anitra with us this evening. I think you probably have read a little bit about her, but just to say that she's had a lengthy career in ecologically sustainable futures, and her research has focused as well on post-capitalism. She's much published. She's the co-author of Exploring Degrowth, a Critical Guide, co-editor of Food for Degrowth, Perspectives and Practices, and Housing for Degrowth, Principles, Models, Challenges, and Opportunities. And as well, the book that I rather like is called Small is Necessary, which deals with the issues about a shared planet. At the moment, she's Honorary Principal Fellow with the Informal Urbanism Research Hub at the Melbourne School of Design. She's had a very interesting career, in actual fact. She's been a visiting fellow at many illustrious facilities. Anyway, so we perhaps better cut to the chase before we lose it again and let Anitra have the floor. So I'd like you to welcome her, please, to talk to us this evening. I think it's going to be a challenging talk because she is clearly shaking the foundations of orthodox economic ideas and accepted social mores and norms. So many thanks, Anitra.
Thank you, Jenny. Yes, well, many thanks for inviting me to your meeting. It's really great to be here today. I mainly live, work and play on Jara country. Just before I get started, maybe I can have the keyboard so I can move stuff along. Okay, thanks. So did you want to get up first? Great. Okay, then, terrific. I mainly live, work and play on Jara country of the Djajarurrung peoples in central Victoria. First Nations peoples lived in regenerative ways in our country. Hundreds of diverse clans had sophisticated understandings of the ecological communities of the locales within which they lived before a destructive white invasion in the late 18th century, which has led to massive inequities today, beyond the numerous deaths of people and damaged country wrought over the past 200 years. So I'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging of the Djajarurrung's people, as well as the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, as the traditional owners and original custodians of this land on which we stand tonight, and to pay respects to any other Aboriginal First Nations people who are present. When we talk about a degrowth future, there are many parallels with First Nations approaches and practices. Degrowth thinking and practice is built on three central tenets. First, degrowth advocates highlight the irrationality of pursuing monetary growth, the core driver of each and every individual capitalist and of capitalism as a whole system. Second, on average, each person today consumes as if we lived on almost two planets, with many societies, such as Australians, consuming as if we had 4 times what Earth is capable of regenerating. So degrowth activists argue for us creating societies that live within safe and secure one planet footprints, And it's clear we can't achieve that without the third tenet, to live equitably. And it is a matter of justice that we do live equitably. These three tenets are central to degrowth principles and practices. So tonight, I'm going to sketch out where the degrowth movement is right now, what degrowth practices look like, and some of the challenges degrowth faces. A formal Australian degrowth network was launched in Melbourne in the National Sustainable Living Festival in February. There are now nodes in various capitals, and we've just started a group in central Victoria where I live. Although the concept degrowth has existed in scientific and political literatures for half a century, the degrowth movement did not burgeon till this 21st century, initially in France, and especially over the last decade, decentering from Europe. Degrowth collaborates with various environmental movements and campaigns, especially on climate action, food security, climate justice, alter globalization, the Union 4-Day Week campaign, and so on. Internally, the movement is maturing with open and well-reasoned debates and discourses on topics as diverse as decolonization and global North-South relations, through to organizational strategies for direct and local provisioning of basic needs, such as food and housing, and implementing substantive democratic processes. Before Degrowth Network Australia, we had a loose informal network between mainly scholars of degrowth, such as Ted Trainer in Sydney and Samuel Alexander, Terry Lay, and myself in Melbourne. In fact, over the last 10 years, dozens of Australian academics have been drawn into advocating for degrowth, publishing articles and books, as well as pieces in The Conversation, and more recently, Green Agenda, a journal associated with the Greens, even though it's not a party mouthpiece. The point is that economies oriented to production for trade seem outdated, ineffective, and inappropriate for a century where key challenges focus on actually satisfying everyone's basic needs directly and taking account of planetary limits. This is why degrowth, with its fingers explicitly critiquing and inverting all the all-encompassing and ever-eroding drive to growth at all costs, strikes such a chord. Moreover, while often misconstrued as austerity and depression, degrowth is really about promoting the satisfaction, as I said before, of each and every person's basic needs, as such addressing inequity. Degrowth argues for a home and food for everyone, which Australian capitalism does not fulfill, even as we use Earth as if there were 4 planets. In essence, degrowth is to growth as quality is to quantity, or better, degrowth is about real values where growth is about monetary values. Degrowth envisages creating socially convivial, economically secure, and ecologically sustainable lives. Degrowth is alter-globalization in sentiment, envisaging a world of global cooperation and interaction. Yet degrowth emphasizes localization of economies and regenerative place-based ecologies and politics, meaning regionalism will likely remain a characteristic of degrowth futures. So its great degrowth is being explored here in our region. Internationally, I think we can go as far as proclaiming that degrowth, which is also known as post-growth, has come of age. Indicators include numerous references in recent reports from 2022 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and a second European Parliament hosted post-growth conference taking place very recently, a couple of weeks ago in Brussels. As efforts towards a sustainable future for humans and their planetary home continue to falter, with global heating driving the intensity and spread of natural disasters, including the COVID pandemic, generalized doubts are growing about economies geared to exponential growth. There's a rapidly growing body of works in English on degrowth topics and contentions, literatures of both a scholarly and a more journalistic and activist nature. With its holistic and radical approach to system change, the term is being explored by ever more disciplines. Just in terms of any of you wanting to do further reading, I thought I'd mention some of those internationally well known as outstanding in the degrowth field. For example, Jorgis Kallis, Julia Steinberger, Jason Hickel, and Kohei Saido. Jorgis Kallis is responsible for 5 books on degrowth, including co-editing a 2014 groundbreaking Routledge collection, Degrowth, a Vocabulary for a New Era. It's been translated into French, German, Spanish, Catalan, Brazilian, Portuguese, Greek, Dutch, Croatian, and Korean. Jason Hickel's degrowth research focuses on inequity and global political economy, as in this book, Less is More, How Degrowth Will Save the World, which has made Book of the Year lists produced by the Financial Times and the New Scientist. These highly respected professors at the Catalan Institute for Environmental Science and Technology at the... Okay, so I'll pick up more or less where I left off. In its original Japanese, Kohei Saido's Marx in the Anthropocene towards the idea of degrowth communism sold over 500,000 copies. A meticulous scholar at the University of Tokyo, Japan, he too has won several prestigious awards for his work. By the way, he'll actually be talking via video at Trades Hall on the 1st of July as a keynote for the Eco-Socialism 2023 conference running over that weekend. Early career activist scholars include Timotei Parike, Eva Hurtbeckers, Adrian Ponto, and Nick Fitzpatrick. Eva has been in the coordination group of the Feminisms and Degrowth Alliance, which has a Twitter site, and works at the University of Turku in Finland, researching ecologically and socially sustainable work in an age of fossil fuel disruptions. Timotei is a French researcher at Lund University in Sweden, whose thesis on degrowth political economy won that university's annual sustainability award. Eva and Belgian Adrian are on the editorial team of the Degrowth Journal. This is a new journal, and he's completing an ethnographic PhD at University College London in the United Kingdom on the degrowth concept of frugal abundance, a term that I'll return to in a minute. Finally, Australian Nick Fitzpatrick is responsible for a groundbreaking analysis of degrowth literature with respect to policy proposals, as he completes a PhD at Nova University in Portugal. Now, frugal abundance, convivial technology, and the imperial mode of living are key unique terms in the degrowth lexicon. The COVID-19 pandemic has already introduced us to the notion and practice of frugal abundance, as people and governments right across the world have asked, what really is essential? What really matters? And how might we most easily satisfy our basic needs? COVID revealed the failings and weaknesses of capitalist economies harnessed to profit and growth, as production via long supply chains that were ruptured, leading to unmet demand, widespread uncertainty and anxiety, and now inflation. In contrast, frugal abundance is a key goal and characteristic of degrowth economies, specifically oriented to ensuring that food, clothing, housing, and health are securely met. The only abundance for degrowth activists is frugal abundance, which inverts the overconsumption and scarcity of capitalist growth economies. Through economies of solidarity oriented around collective sufficiency in localized production and exchange, degrowth economies aim to meet every single person's basic needs, emphasizing a key principle of degrowth reduction as a reduction in inequality. Let's catch up to where we should be. Degrowth is a provocation that questions growth economies' contradictory focus on quantity, money, and scarcity. Degrowth calls to orient our economies instead on enhancing our quality of life. Degrowth practices focus on achieving the real abundance that results from solidarity and working with nature, respecting Earth's limits and engaging in its regeneration. In contrast to the false security sought through bigger, better, and faster, degrowth nurtures a transformative culture of minimization, of slowing down and valuing diverse human and ecological qualities and the perpetually cyclical dynamics of life. That is why the snail is a symbol of degrowth, and why degrowth advocates argue for horizontalist approaches in collective governance, collective reliance, and collective autonomy. In two books that I've co-edited, Housing for Degrowth and Food for Degrowth, there are many examples of degrowth in practice, in operation. Many of us are familiar with making homes more sustainable, but degrowth emphasizes reusing materials, repairing existing houses, and repurposing other buildings for housing. Degrowth isn't so much about individual voluntary simplicity as it is about collectively designing and living in eco-collaborative housing. Here, sharing, caring, and commoning are most easily practiced, and many such intentional communities integrate aspects of work at home, such as co-working spaces and maker workshops. I'm going to illustrate this with 3 examples by drawing on work I've co-written in chapters in a book called Post-Growth Planning that was published last year, and Post-Carbon Inclusion, which is due out next year. In contrast to simply tweaking mainstream commercial housing models by integrating certain eco-sustainability and community-oriented features, many degrowth housing models challenge private ownerships, consciously withdraw housing from the conventional market, and point to deep post-carbon living. Typically, residents take up less dwelling space per capita and live in more tightly knit, self-governing, but outward-looking and diverse community, marking a clear shift towards inclusionary, decarbonising models. Here, this is a design of a small house using all kinds of recycled materials that a couple got many of their friends to help with actually creating. The first model that I'm going to talk about is LILAC. It's that stands for Low Impact Living Affordable Community. It's a mutual home ownership financial model of 20 households in a cooperative co-housing project in West Leeds in the UK. Residents there buy a mutual share, which is capped in value to ensure affordability to all potential members. Self-governance and reciprocity are at the core of this cooperative society. Every resident actually leases their homes via a member charge, which is 1/3 of their net income, whatever their income is. And there are people there who are on welfare, and there are people who are doctors and professors. Every resident leases their homes via a member charge of this 1/3 of their net income, and they increase their equity that way, which, however, is linked to average UK wages rather than to average UK house prices. This effectively decouples the cost of their housing from the market. Although they have private dwellings designed for environmental sustainability, they're able to economise on cars, they share common facilities, spaces, and activities. Now, the second example is a Zurich, Switzerland model of radical young housing cooperatives, they're called, such as these two large vertical housing projects. This one, Kalkbright, and the next slide will be Kraftwerk. Lilac developed against the odds in a disabling regulatory and financial environment, but Zurich cooperatives developed in an enabling environment due to the city's unique century-long history of facilitating housing cooperatives. Following a 2011 referendum, more than a quarter of Zurich apartments belong to housing cooperatives. Now, the radical young housing cooperatives stretch this conventional model by integrating low carbon building and design features and simple living cultures directed at minimizing dwellers' ecological footprints. Their standard is 10 billion people living equitably within planetary limits. Lilac and the young housing cooperatives demonstrate mutualism, and their practices point to commoning to support mundane ecological practices and to enhance inclusion. Zurich apartment housing cooperatives must actually prove to the city authorities that their membership demographic is qualitatively and proportionately reflecting of the diversity of the whole city demographic, such as the number of non-Swiss. Cooperative members co-own their land and buildings through shares, offering permanent, full and equitable rights, in effect securing affordable rental tenancies, alongside governing their cooperatives in transparent and responsible ways. Some cooperative housing is allocated to social housing tenants, whose experience therefore is equivalent to every other kind of resident. Given the scale and diverse internal plans of apartments, households can readily transfer to more appropriate housing as their composition changes over time. A third degrowth model, offering house seekers ways to collectively develop and withdraw housing from the real estate market in collaborative ways, is the Apartment House Syndicate meets Hauser Syndikat. It's an umbrella organisation now embracing going on for around 200 autonomous self-organising housing projects, each independently owned as a limited liability company. While they describe that starting up such housing projects is often an economic high-wire act, their words, new projects are advised and supported by established ones. Solidarity and organisation centres on the syndicate aim to support self-organising housing projects and wider political acceptance of the need for decent shelter for everyone. Alongside advocacy for particular syndicate housing projects, members engage in urban planning and housing forums and debates in support of affordable housing in good condition for everyone. A general meeting of the syndicate decides or not to purchase an interest in each specific house as a company. Among key conditions, the household must be self-organising, and the association has a right to veto future sales of the house and or land via a payment of solidarity contribution and the promise of free sharing of knowledge and practical support of other projects. In other words, if a household decides that they or disintegrates, they actually sell their house back to the overall syndicate so that then it can be passed on to a new household. In this way, each housing project initially benefits from, and then they pay back support for purchasing through paying off loans and through to housing repair and operations, all with a view to eco-sustainability as well as affordability. So every household that benefits from when it initially purchases a house through the syndicate, they benefit from other members having developed skills in repairing households and running households and paying back loans, and then they themselves are able to pass those skills on to others. So the association benefits from these diverse different housing projects that exist in various stages. General meetings allow for sharing information, mutual trust, workshops, and general intercourse between members. The approach to all relations and processes and communication is, and I quote, open-minded, non-hierarchical, and respectful. So due diligence is paid to conflict resolution. These three examples of degrowth housing illustrate transparently political and collective do-it-ourselves approaches, models that support post-carbon inclusion through their practical attention to affordability and access, diversity, as well as sharing and commoning. They indicate how degrowth activists take practical action that they deem to be transformational to assist a broader transition to degrowth futures. Similarly, our Food for Degrowth collection includes degrowth versions of community-supported agriculture, emphasising collective provisioning of food to close to end eaters, collective preserving and storage, and sharing of food that otherwise would be wasted. So let's turn then to convivial technology, because this is slightly amusing given the degrowth approach to technology with our experience tonight. While we do need to have electricity made from renewable sources, the transition actually threatens, the green transition that many are mooting, threatens to generate mountains of waste and destruction. Just replacing fossil fuel powered cars with fleets of electric cars, for example, requires vast amounts of newly sourced materials. And these include critical rare earth elements that all of this technology around here depends on, and all of which involve controversial extractive practices that damage ecosystems and fail to account for the uneven burdens that are felt by poor and vulnerable people, often in the global south or many of our Aboriginal communities. And these people can't even afford price hikes or to purchase eco-friendly appliances and devices. To make matters worse, burgeoning markets for carbon offsets or carbon credits allow the wealthy to pollute at the expense of the poor and delay moving from business as usual. So instead of clean technologies, degrowth advocates argue that Earth and humankind need convivial technology. This concept originated with the Roman Catholic philosopher Ivan Illich, who many of you are probably familiar with. And it's been further developed by modern thinkers such as degrowth activist Andrea Vetter, and focusing on tools and production techniques that are easily understood, easily created, simply repaired, and that assist people to fulfill their basic needs. In practice, convivial technology is used in transport, food growing, self-provisioned housing, and much more, all grounded in cooperative, mutually agreeable and sharing approaches that together comprise a convivial society. Such a society is integral to realizing degrowth, with its focus on quality of life, social and ecological values, and modest use of materials and energy. The 2022 IPC report that I mentioned before describes such degrowth approaches, and I quote, as a set of measures and daily practices that avoid demand for energy, materials, land, and water, while delivering human well-being for all within planetary boundaries. And the IPC acknowledges that the degrowth movement, with its focus on sustainability over profitability, has, in their words, the potential to speed up transformations towards a zero carbon or negative carbon economy. So what does convivial technology look like? We can walk, ride bikes, use cargo bikes and take public transportation rather than use motorized vehicles, even electric ones. We can transform parking lots into permaculture gardens, self-sustaining ecosystems in which human activity and nature are integrated. We can plant productive trees throughout cities to diminish heat in dense urban precincts and to provide wood trees bearing fruits and nuts, all maintained by local communities. The Los Angeles Eco Village, which will turn 30 years old this year, features all these initiatives and more. It covers 2 blocks of Los Angeles in a neighborhood of 500 people. And its members have influenced city mobility policies such as developing bike lanes. Cargonomia, which was co-founded in 2015, is a convivial degrowth formation in Budapest that's based on 3 enterprises, which demonstrate on how degrowth works. One of these initiatives is Cyclonomia, a self-organizing do-it-yourself bicycle cooperative that operates along degrowth principles of conviviality, cooperation, mutual support, and sharing. The bicycle, which is easy to build, use, and repair, and is ecologically frugal, is a great example of a convivial tool. So that's one of them in one of their events in Budapest. Cyclonomia helps members use its workshop itself to repair their own bikes. And their team also hires out these bike trailers and cargo bikes to carry people and shopping and to be used as a substitute for delivery trucks, which was really successful during COVID. The other linked enterprise is this organic vegetable farm and educational centre for training the community in sustainable agriculture. Vegetables grown there and at neighbouring partner farms are ferried to collection points in Budapest by a 3rd self-organised Cargonomia venture called Kantar, a bike messenger and delivery service. Budapest is far from the only city where such schemes flourish. The Share City research team at Trinity College in Dublin has explored food sharing activities in 100 cities worldwide. The organic farm that Cargonomia is associated with supplies fresh groceries to people in Budapest, and it also serves as a community training centre for sustainable agriculture. Sourcing food as close as possible to eaters, they provide for mainly plant-based diets and seasonal organic food that's appropriate to the local climate and soils. In convivial approaches, food eaters typically produce at least some of their food. The microfarm offers members opportunities to work flexibly. It follows principles of regenerative agriculture and permaculture, which offers greater resilience against global warming. Such farming practices, which rely on convivial tools such as horses rather than tractors, are especially important for improving resilience to the impacts of global heating. Recent rises in food prices, whether from COVID or from the war in Ukraine, have prompted a renewed interest in such locally sourced food. Degrowth initiatives reuse and adapt out-of-date industrial infrastructure for numerous types of artisanal work and for housing. Cargonomia occupies such repurposed buildings for its bicycle activities and is renovating a very old cottage on their farm. In urban and rural areas, degrowth housing involves building simply designed, modest dwellings with low ecological impacts by reusing local at-hand materials while benefiting from collective work parties. Precincts of such residents develop off-grid water, sanitation, and energy services. In all these kinds of ways, convivial technology helps communities achieve zero carbon or even negative carbon living, in contrast to clean technology, which ultimately means using more to create more. In short, degrowth and convivial technology work hand in hand to minimize extractive industries and overproduction, reducing carbon emissions at source. So finally, I'll just quickly describe the novel concept of an imperial mode of living. In analysing and responding to injustices generated at a global scale, Ulrich Brand and Marcus Wisson coined the concept several years ago. It refers to standards of living in the minority world in which we live that arise from and regenerate poor social and ecological conditions in the majority world, also known as the Global South. They note that production and consumption patterns depend on the import of underpriced commodities as well as on human and natural resources, not exclusively, but particularly from the dependent countries of the world economy. In the case of Australia, we depend a lot on Chinese workers and Chinese landscapes for the different kinds of basic needs that are fulfilled through supermarkets and other kinds of retail stores. They argue that wage earners are forced into these patterns because of their what they call subaltern status in capitalist societies. In other words, living standards and terms of trades result from complex institutional and structural factors. So a lot of us as individuals actually can't make the kind of decisions that we want to with respect to being more fair and equitable in what we purchase and how we live. Neither simplistic nor classless, this imperial mode of living concept was developed to heighten consciousness of and facilitate agency to address various forms of international inequity, exclusion, and unsustainability that are expressed in complicated contemporary crises, from climate heating or global heating to absolute poverty and to failed democracies. They offer a solution by way of an alternative, which they call solidarity mode of living, incorporating convivial technologies and frugal abundance, pursued by degrowth activists and scholars, as well as holistic feminist visions of a care economy. As such, they argue for various activities and strategies in a movement of global solidarity that copes with multiple crises of overcoming what they call the imperial mode of living. Constructive advances promised by degrowth thought and activities in both urban and rural contexts and in various regions still face numerous barriers. People who benefit from the current global structures of trade are often in denial about their privilege. They deny the need for and the objectives of degrowth. Moreover, a key area of critical contention within degrowth regards impacts of degrowth reforms on monetary systems. So I've actually belonged to a minority faction within the degrowth and the socialist movements, arguing for non-monetary economies and for non-market socialism. Now, those arguments are complex and they really deserve another talk at another time. Suffice to say that I've actually got a couple of free copies of this book, Beyond Money, a Post-Capitalist Strategy, to share with anyone who's interested. I've also got a copy of the book Exploring Degrowth that I co-authored with Vincent Léger, who is part of that Kogonomia Budapest degrowth formation. And I can pass on to anyone who's interested, maybe send to Jenny the Vimeo link to a short 8-minute film that I've made that's actually based on the 3rd chapter of the Beyond Money book, but a lot of people who've watched it say that they think that it's very much like what a degrowth economy would look like. So thank you very much for your time. I don't know if I've lost my, I've come to the end of that more or less anyway. The last, good. I'll just put that on. There you are.
Yes. Thank you, Anitra. I think we might give you a few moments to just catch your breath, and I'll make a few announcements about what's coming up.
Yeah.
And then we'll move into Q&A. So please, I'm sure it's raised a lot of questions. So if you could think of what you'd really like to ask Anitra when we move into that. We had a late start, but we've still got about 20 to 30 minutes, if that's okay with you.
Yep.
And we'll also call for questions from our online audience. So if you could put your question in the chat or put your hand up, and Howard will help us monitor that. So what I'd like to draw your attention to is what's coming up. And I'd like to invite you to go to the website. There's a lot happening, and I'll just give you the most immediate information. The next public talk that we'll be having on the 4th Thursday, which is when we hold them, will be Thursday, the 22nd of June. And we'll be attempting once again to have a hybrid meeting on this occasion. Because it's a very interesting topic and we'd like to include as many people as possible. But we'll be having the audience here in the Baldwin Library, and it's a great opportunity to meet other people and meet some, humanists you haven't seen for a while, or if you're not a humanist, to meet a few. But it will be an online event as well, and so on. The speaker on that occasion is going to be Ari Freiberg, who's recently stepped down from the Victorian Sentencing Committee, and he has a wealth of experience. He's going to talk on this occasion about Indigenous in justice, sentencing Indigenous offenders in Victoria. And of course, as we know from what we heard in the Uluru statement, it's a topic we really need to delve into, to tease out, to get some insights about what's at stake, or what's producing the overrepresentation of the Indigenous members of our community in the prison system. So that'll be on Thursday, the 22nd of June. But before then, Les Allen, who runs Philosophy Matters, will be having one of his group meetings online on Sunday at 10 a.m. And that group are reading chapter by chapter a book called A Historical Introduction to the Philosophy of Science. So they're up to chapter 17. That's the justification of evaluative standards. So that's Sunday, the 28th. That's this Sunday coming up at 10 o'clock. And the only other thing I'd like to tell you about tonight is that on Wednesday, the 7th of June, Robert Bender, who's in the audience as well, is going to have an online talk about what is humanism. So he's been a humanist for 4 decades. And so he has a wealth of experience about what it's meant for him and some of the campaigns and chapters of humanism within our community over that time. And he'll talk about the sort of core values of humanism as well. So you might know someone who's a little bit kind of uncertain about what humanism has been about. So you might mention that to anyone who you think might be interested. Okay, so I think that's about all I wanted to say, but I would encourage you to look at the website, see what we've been doing. We're in the process of upgrading it, but there's a lot of information about our past activities and what's coming up. And you can join up as a subscriber there or even become a member. So please do that if you're interested. Okay, so let's move over to Q&A. Is there anyone in the room who would like to ask a question? Yes.
Thank you very much. I've actually recently joined your degrowth network. And I'm very passionate about degrowth, ecological, whatever, and also modern monetary theory, MMT. And I'm interested in your experience, because I get the feeling there's a lot of groupthink goes on amongst economists. And I was wondering if you'd like to expound on how you've experienced it or how you see it. Because I think that's one of the issues we have, the amount of groupthink there is.
Okay, so that's a pretty big topic. My interest in money started to some extent as an activist, but I ended up doing a PhD on Karl Marx's concept of money, and so like I'm sort of very used to kind of like critiques of economics. So as I see it, we have a marketplace out there, and we're really at an incredibly complicated and sophisticated level of a market society, whereby a lot of our relationships with one another are actually conditioned by economics. I mean, I see that a lot of economics, from my point of view, simply rationalizes or idealizes and/or is ideology about things that we experience out there that are very less than satisfactory. So yeah, I could go on and on about that, but I can give you a copy of my Beyond Money, a Post-Capitalist Strategy, because that kind of goes into a lot of those kind of dynamics. Yeah.
Because there's not a lot of diversity in.
No, well, I mean, in the area, there in economics, there's a group of economists called heterodox economists. Okay, so, and they're the closest that I get to, and they're good. I mean, they're happy to listen to what's wrong. I mean, a lot of the waste in our society comes from the fact that we have all of our production is for trade. Well, the vast majority of our production is for trade. And as far as economists are concerned, that's all they talk about anyway. Whereas, and so there's a minority, a very small elite of people who are making decisions about what they're going to sell. And so they decide, you know, what we can go and choose to purchase. We right at the moment, and that's made without any sort of real knowledge of what people want or how much they want to pay for it. And people go to work and they work to those people's plans and designs, okay? And all of that is thrown out onto the market, okay? And a lot of it is wasted. So right from the beginning, capitalism produces waste, just from that kind of design of the way of production for trade. Whereas what we actually really badly need right now is more or less large communities of people deciding what their basic needs are, and as much as possible collectively producing to their own demand. You don't need a market whatsoever, because it's like production on demand that sometimes we do. If someone has a book and they only print it if 100 people have asked for the book, you know. So it's similar, but on a big scale. If we did that, we wouldn't be getting anywhere near the waste that we have. And we could actually have circular economies and all these good ideas that people have, but which really, once they get sucked into the market, get perverted and changed, you know, by the very nature of it.
Yes, please.
Anitra, thanks for a fascinating talk.
Hang on, we're getting the mic to you. I mean, you probably don't need it, but...
Anitra, thanks for a fascinating talk and discussion. I was really interested in what you said about decentralized leadership and local decision making. And given that we're sitting right here in the city of Boroondara, which is a council area, do you think that getting councils on board, or where does local government fit into transforming society in the way that you've described?
I personally think that that local government is the most important government, and I would love to see local governments funded a lot more. In fact, I've sometimes thought, wouldn't it be great if we just had a federal government and local governments, and all of the money that goes to state governments could be divvied up to councils? Because like in central Victoria, we've got a housing crisis, but it's a particular kind of housing crisis. Different people in different areas have different problems. And interestingly, in terms of sustainability, it's a generally accepted fact now. There's clear evidence over the last 3 decades that local government has achieved the majority of transformations in terms of making more sustainable futures. The programs that local governments have had in terms of solar panels, in terms of encouraging people with composting, in terms of helping with the bigger infrastructure required for people to have different waste collections and all of those kinds of things. All of these things, these basic needs, this is where all the action is. So I would love to see local government strengthened, and I would love to see people being able to have more impact on local council. You know, there are movements for deliberative democracy, for citizens' input to budgets and all kinds of things like that. And in central Victoria, we have quite a few groups that are pushing very hard for having the kinds of community conversations, the kitchen conversations, all of that kind of thing, so that our councillors and our council staff have a clearer idea of what people really want and responding to that.
I'm just trying to see if we can sort out what's
Yeah.
going on here. Yeah, unfortunately. Robert.
Yeah, one of the fastest growing industries in our rapid growth world is mass tourism and cruise industries and that sort of stuff. And I suspect if people are serious about living locally, all of that just has to stop dead. I was wondering whether you've thought about the consequences of imposing that sort of restriction on people's freedom to travel the world and enthusiasm for traveling to exotic places, for that matter.
Yeah, so I think that that you're right, that especially air travel, you know, is just incredibly expensive in terms of carbon emissions. But I mean, I also just think that tourism in and of itself can have, the way that it's commercialized, has a very false way also of relating to other people. So there are ecological impacts, and I think that there are detrimental social impacts as well. So degrowth activists and advocates think that what we need is to have more genuine and slower kinds of experiences of other people. And for the Housing for Degrowth book that Francois Schneider and I edited, Francois lives in the south of France. We took the book, which had about up to 30 contributors to it, many of them from Europe. We went for a tour with that for 39 days. I think we did 27 events, and we visited 11 countries. And we did it all by train, by bike, and by walking. And we took one ferry. And so what degrowth activists try to do, you know, when we do things, you know, degrowth activities, is exactly that kind of thing. So it's not uncommon for, there's the 9th International Degrowth Conference is taking place in Zagreb, Croatia this year. There will be different kind of contingents of degrowth activists from different countries who will all be trying to organize, you know, the most ecologically friendly ways to come and visit Zagreb. And degrowth conferences in and of themselves are really interesting. The first one I went to was in 2012 in Montreal, when I was actually staying in New York for several months. And there's all of the food is local and prepared by local people, but quite a lot of the food will be dumpster dived. You know, it will be waste food. It's always delicious. It's the most delicious food I've had at any conference. There's a lot of attention paid to not making too much food, and it all being fresh and that kind of thing. So I would see degrowth tourism as being very kind of convivial, very much about basic things in life and people enjoying landscapes and people for their cultures and diversity and that kind of thing. So I don't see tourism as such, kind of like, I think tourism is a very commercial word, but I would see a degrowth future as in still involving a lot of curiosity and interest in other places and people, but doing it in ways that that mean that the earth isn't kind of like impacted badly and that other people aren't exploited by it.
One of the valuable aspects of tourism, though, might be that you could get a better experience of how degrowth is playing out in other communities, because there's not a lot of evidence about it here. I mean, I'm reminded of the Japanese idea of wabi-sabi, which is a kind of a real appreciation of things that are old. And so they recycle fabric, and they treasure old ceramics, and they'll mend them with little bits of gold and this kind of thing. There is it is a different approach. New is not necessarily the ultimate goal. Steve, are you
There is a question from Zoom.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Howard reports that he cannot unmute the participants, unfortunately.
I see.
But he tells me that there is an important question from Rod Bauer on Zoom, which is, if I remember correctly, could the speaker explain what life in Australia would be like from the present situation if we approach this sustainable ideal?
Okay, well, I tried to give a bit of a flavour of that in talking about housing and food. I also think that we would probably see people resettle land so that there would be a lot of decentralisation, because I think that cities are really kind of quite an artificial kind of way for people to be living. Then it means that it's very difficult for people to be producing food for themselves. In our Food for Degrowth book, we actually had a chapter on whether, for instance, Melbourne would be able to, in its projected kind of, even at the moment with 4 million, but it's projected 8 million. Okay, it can't produce enough food within its own boundaries or anything else like that. And this is partly because permaculture advocates Samuel Alexander and Brendan Gleeson from University of Melbourne put out a really interesting book called Degrowth in the Suburbs. And their argument was that we could have degrowth now, especially because the suburbs are spread so far. If we kind of like ripped up roads and we grew in the back gardens and all of that kind of thing. But someone else who's worked a lot on permaculture in Africa did a kind of back of the envelope estimate of sort of really, if we know kind of like how much land is usually required to feed one person. And if you do those kind of estimates, it's more or less impossible. So the point is that if we decentralized, and I would see that people would be in smaller communities and, as I say, working a lot more to fulfilling their own needs within their communities, and then there being certain exchange of things, because not every landscape has salt in it, or there are whole various things, so there would still be exchanges between people. But one of the best ways for you to be able to estimate that you're not actually going beyond a one planet footprint is if you have a smaller community. So it'd be vastly different. But I would see, this is where I would see the whole thrust of there being a lot more leadership from First Nations people who really do understand landscapes in these very basic needs kinds of ways, as being really kind of important.
That's an interesting connection. Yes. Yes, would you like to? We'll have two more questions. This is the second last. Steve, if you could proffer the microphone, please.
Thanks for your talk. I'm from Peru, from South America. So this is the first time that I hear about degrowth, but I try to understand everything. And I don't know, the only analogy that I can have is similar to how tribes lives in the Amazon, or how Aboriginals used to live here 60,000 years. And actually, they were very developed, but they never grow as civilizations nowadays, because they have a strong connection with the environment and they live every day as the last day. So in the world that we live, like, we are not living in that way anymore. I cannot imagine a scenario where everyone is in the growth mode, because then we need to sacrifice health, we need to sacrifice universities. Like, if everyone needs to have equal opportunities, and then limited resources, and everyone is growing their own things. Like, I cannot imagine how we are going to pay people, like, to produce more medicine, to have hospitals, like so many things that makes different countries different. Like, for example, Australia compared to Venezuela or Peru, like super developed countries compared to third world countries. Like, I don't see how it may work in a large scale, because there can be models or little examples of people with the same ideology that work probably in housing and things like that, but I cannot see the whole figure working all together.
Good. Well, you kind of, like, there are a number of kind of questions there. So I'll just pick up on the first few that you sort of mentioned, and like health and education. And, like, I think that health is a really interesting one, because if you look at our health system, if you look at the way it's advertised, it's promoted or whatever, there are all these, wonderful discoveries and amazing things. But in actual fact, because of heavily processed foods, it's estimated that Americans, for instance, are dying more from the impacts of eating those processed foods. More of them are dying from that. Around 60% of deaths they attribute to diet, okay? And more than any of the wars that Americans have died in. So you actually need to be looking at the whole of society. And, I think that probably if people lived in ways that prevented those kinds of illnesses that people have, like diabetes and a range of other ones, we'd be looking at a whole different kind of health complex, and different ways of approaching health. And it'd be very similar with education. I think that we've disconnected a lot of education with people's work. Like, so when I was young, a third of my fourth form class went into nursing. Okay. Today, if people go into nursing, they go straight to universities for a number of years. Okay. And then they do hospital work. Back in those days, girls of 16 years old would go, and they'd go straight into boarding right next to the hospital and into the hospital wards and doing stuff. Okay. And degrowth is very much like that. It is, in a sense, it's going back, because I think actually there are various ways in which capitalism, like, again, wastes a lot of resources in the whole way it approaches education and health. So I think that, you could have really big conversations about this, but they have to be at about that level. But I wondered if you have come across Bienvenue, Good Life, Bienvenue. No. There are various degrowth advocates from Latin America who actually draw on traditional, often Indian kind of ways of living and philosophies and that kind of thing. And their work is really fantastic. Yeah, yeah. Have you heard of Eduardo Galeano? He's,
I think, yeah.
yeah, an Uruguayan. Yeah. So a lot of his work kind of really questions all of these things as well, and sort of goes back to those ways. I suppose it's a kind of like a more wholesome life, the good life kind of thing. Yeah.
I think for them it's good life, no? Like they have less life expectancy and everything, but like they live better than many people nowadays. They decided to stay uncontacted. They decided to stay isolated from civilization. They know it exists, but they don't like it.
Yeah.
Because they will be.
American life expectancy has been falling over the last 5 years. The wonderful capitalist, you know, it's like this, depends where you are on the social scale. Yeah,
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's falling.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's where I think, I mean, one thing that I would say is degrowth might draw on traditional ways of doing various things. But the whole idea is that people decide about what technology they use. It's about, this is the autonomy which is central to degrowth, is that people decide these things. And from that point of view, we won't necessarily throw out laptops or this, that, and the other. We would probably use them less, share them more, all of that kind of thing, rather than tossing things out and not having surgery or any of those kinds of things. And also, you know, like a lot of people don't enjoy the benefits of health, you know, that we have on offer. They can't afford to.
It's a bit selective, and there's quite a bit of what we call iatrogenic illness too, you know, related to medical care, and so on. That's another topic as well. Steve, this is the last question. Are you feeding something?
We can see the chat
okay,
on the screen. Thank you. And I'd like to put the question: growth is driven partly by population. What is your view of the amount of immigration to Australia?
Okay, so I think that it's really difficult to work out what the carrying capacity of Earth is. If we look at a degrowth future, definitely it's hard to tell because there are a whole lot of people who are undernourished and aren't getting enough food and haven't got basic good conditions and that kind of thing. So those people their living conditions need to be raised. But there's also massive waste of resources by a whole lot of people. And so I think that to talk about the issues of immigration today in Australia, it's not a degrowth country or whatever anyway. But I think that the way that the degrowth network in general looks at population is this. The biggest problem are those people who are the most wealthy and who are driving growth and also consuming and over-consuming too much. So it's not a matter of population per se. That said, most degrowth people, like myself, I have not had children, okay? And a lot of degrowth people will only have 1 or 2 children, okay? But that's partly we live in a world where there's a whole lot of people who are just very indulgent and they just do what they want, kind of thing. And Earth definitely cannot, so, you know, is suffering partly because of that. But it's not just a population issue. The inequality aspect of it is absolutely key to any conversation about population. But I would also say that Australia is a very fragile environment. It's the oldest continent on Earth. And of all places, there is its limit.
Thank you. So, thank you, Anitra. There have been a number of very large ideas to ponder about tonight, but it's been marvelous to get some practical examples of the lived experience and that it's possible. And I'm sure that we'd all like to know exactly how that comes about, you know, what the pathway is to make this a reality. I'm not sure if you feel you could spend a little bit of extra time if people have questions they haven't had an opportunity to ask. Yes. So Anitra will be around if you've got other aspects of this that you'd like to tease out.
I could also send you a couple of links.
Yes.
So that if
Thank
people
you.
are interested in following up, you know, some of these issues, I
Yes.
could just send you.
Okay. Thank you very
and
much.
You can circulate that.
Anyone who's interested might need to send me an email and I can then pass that on. So I'd like you to join with me in thanking Anitra in the usual fashion. She's been very generous with her time, and I'm sure it's been a very challenging and provocative talk this evening, and one that we need to go on talking about. So many thanks, Anitra.